Hello and welcome to Science Matters. I'm Alethea Chang. We have a wonderful episode for you today. We take you behind closed gates to the Mannheim Treatment Center to find out what's in the water in Waterloo. Plus, we talk about water pollution, water policy, water governance, and finally, we get some tips from the Waterloo region about how you can conserve water in your home. Now I'm here with Dan Mahar of the Region of Waterloo Water Services, and Dan, like me, loves the water cycle. So Dan, tell me all about how is the water cycled in our environment?
Well, the water cycle is actually an appropriate name. It just references how water is constantly moving through the environment. It's never stationary. One thing that people tend not to realize is that we always are going to have the same amount of water on Earth. It never disappears. We can't get rid of it, and we can't create more. It's just moving, and it's changing forms, changing locations. So water may be stored in a cloud, and when condensation occurs, it comes down as rain onto the land. When it does so, one of two things generally happens. It can be runoff, so it bounces off the land and runs into creeks, streams, lakes, surface water, or it can percolate and infiltrate down into the ground and become part of the groundwater. Anywhere you stand, if you dig far enough into the ground, you'll find water, and that's where the groundwater is. It's also flowing underground, a lot slower, of course, than a river because it's going through the ground matter and material. And then the lakes and rivers as well are flowing, so it's constantly on the move. Then once it's there, it can evaporate from the surface water, go back up as vapor into the clouds, or it can transpire from plants when they're done with using the water. Same thing happens, goes up into the clouds. Clouds move the water around, turns back into liquid, comes down. So it's constantly moving and changing, and the human impact on it could be if we take, for instance, too much water out of a lake or a river or from the ground, we can slow down the flow of it or speed it up depending on what we do. So humans can have impact on the water cycle, but it's always kind of doing the same things in the environment.
Right, and so outside it's raining today, or it was raining today, and so what would happen to the water that goes through the sewers in the water cycle?
Well, rainstorms are an issue that most cities have to deal with because you have this influx of water coming in all at the same time, which we have to deal with. But rain is a very good thing for the natural environment because it's what we end up calling recharge. So there's areas where when the water hits those areas, it will infiltrate into the ground, replenish our groundwater supplies, reestablish the levels in our lakes and creeks and those sorts of things. And then any excess we have to deal with in various ways, stormwater management, ponds, and et cetera. And we have to have a whole bunch of natural and as well as artificial infrastructure to deal with it.
So you're going to show me how this groundwater simulator works. So walk me through the steps.
Sure. Well, in the groundwater simulator, you'll see we have a recharge area. So that simulates where the rain's coming in and hitting the land. And from there, it will find its way onto the grass. And once it's on the grass, it filters down into the ground. And once it's in the ground, there's a series of wells. They could be private wells. There's underground storage tanks. There's deep municipal wells. So as the water filters down through the ground, it will find its way into these wells, and we can extract it from there. And it'll show the water flowing through the ground material. And there's a layer called the aquitard, which is clay, where water cannot get below. So anything below there is confined or protected. And as the water moves through the ground, you can also see it encounter lakes and surface water, creeks and streams, so it will infiltrate into there as well. So over time, it kind of represents how it would work over time. If you had a period of 4 or 5 years, that's the time lapse you would see in the model when the water moves from one end to the other.
So what can we, as the residents of the region of Waterloo, do to help conserve water or protect water?
They're kind of hand in hand. There's a lot of things we can do in terms of protecting the water. You have to be really careful what you're putting on the ground. Any kind of household products like paint, oil, pesticides, those sorts of things. When they're on the ground, they eventually will, just like the water, filter through the ground material and join with the water and end up potentially into wells or municipal or private. So that's one key thing for people to do to protect it. And in terms of conserving, at your home, you can do lots of things. In the gardens, use rain barrels, water by hand, use alternatives to lawns, which take up a lot of water. In the house, low-flow toilets, low-flow aerators and shower heads. All those sorts of things really help reduce the amount of water we need to treat and send out in the system.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Dan Mahar is from the Region of Waterloo Water Services. Welcome back to Science Matters. Now, before the break, we talked about how water cycles in our environment. But if we take a closer look at the water cycle, we'll see that through the process, there's actually contaminants, chemicals, compounds that are being introduced into the water. And that not only changes the quality of the water itself, but it also changes the quality of life for the organisms that are living in the water. Now, joining me here today on the show is Jennifer Ings, who is a PhD student in the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo, and she's studying how the quality of life for fish, specifically rainbow trout, is changed by this kind of change in the water. So Jennifer, tell me about why are you studying the rainbow trout, and what are you finding in terms of the wastewater effluent effects on the quality of life of the fish?
Well, I'm studying rainbow trout because they're a good model organism. They're kind of representative of a lot of the fish species that we find in this area. And what I'm finding is that despite extremely clean effluent that's coming from some of the plants in our region, we're still seeing some changes, subchronic changes in the way that the fish are able to respond to life in the environment, specifically how they respond to stress and how they use the energy resources within their body in order to grow and reproduce.
So what are good indicators of stress for the fish?
What we use as an indicator of stress is actually a hormone that we measure in their blood called cortisol. And we're seeing that in fish that are exposed to this wastewater, they're having high levels of cortisol. And subsequently, with these high levels of cortisol, they're also not able to respond to additional stress that they might encounter. And that would be, in the case of a wild fish, would be predator-prey interactions, or changes in temperature, or changes in water flow. So with this disruption in this hormone, we're actually seeing that that's causing a problem with the fish to be able to respond to what they would naturally be exposed to. So this is occurring within fish that are exposed to the wastewater effluent. So over time, and with a problem of this magnitude, you might see effects on growth, and also the ability of the fish to reproduce or have the energy required for reproduction if they're exposed over a long period of time.
So while Jen was talking to us about how the quality of water affects the quality of life of fish, we want to find out how exactly is the quality of water in a lake measured. So joining me here today is master's student in the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo, Jana Tondu. So Jana, tell me about how we can kind of assess the health of a lake.
Right, well, sometimes we are concerned about the health of what an aquatic ecosystem is, and it can be impacted by things like climate change or human development. So sometimes when we're thinking about that, we can actually take, it's called a sediment core, and we use a science called paleolimnology. And so basically what the premise is in the summertime, a lake is really active and it's got a lot of algae and bugs growing, and in the wintertime when everything's calm and there's ice over, everything kind of falls from the water and into the sediment. And year after year this happens, and it forms our layers. And these layers are actually an archive underneath the lake. So what we do is we take a sediment core of this archive and we look at it to kind of get an idea of what the past conditions were like, so you can assess the health of the ecosystem, so you can see when it changed, why it changed, and what direction the change is going in. So sometimes we'll take a boat out into the middle of the lake, and we'll use a contraption, and we'll get a core like the one that's there, and then we'll section it layer by layer, usually at 0.5 centimeter intervals, and then we'll date it, and then we'll analyze the chemistry and the algae that are in each specific layer, and it'll give us a really good resolution of what's going on into the lake. And this can be really valuable, especially when it comes down to lake management and like, oh, well, what is the health of our lake, and how do we manage that appropriately? So for example, is involved in a class with the Old DuSable Channel. They had a question about the health of the Old DuSable Channel, which is near the Pinery Provincial Park. And so basically this with the lake used to be a channel, so it used to be part of a river, but then the inflow was cut off, so now it effectively is a lake. And then in the 1980s, cottages started to develop around there. And then in the late 1990s, people were starting to notice all of these weeds growing in the bottom and that the lake was changing. And so it made it difficult to boat around in. It wasn't very aesthetically pleasing. And then they were concerned, it was like, well, maybe this pond is going to turn into a terrestrial ecosystem because it's been cut off from this inflow.
Right.
So what they wanted to do is they wanted to pull out all the plants because so it'd be easier to boat around in and
Right.
stuff. And then the Conservation Authority was like, well, we found 3 endangered fish species in this pond, and if we pull out all the plants, it's going to harm them. So they didn't really know what to do, and so they came to us, and we took a sediment core to kind of assess what really the change is, what rate it's happening, and how we can best manage the system. So when we took our sediment core, what we found was in the 1980s, when the cottages started to become developed,
Right.
there was an increase of nutrients into the lake and into the water.
Wow.
And so this increase of nutrients helped the algae grow, which helped the plants grow. And then in the 1990s, the nutrients had gotten so high that you could noticeably see these changes. And then in the last few years, they had kind of implemented some better management practices in regards to sewer and lawn care to kind of reduce the nutrients. And when we looked at our core, we kind of actually saw a decline in the algae. So the best management for the Old LaSalle Channel was to just reduce the nutrient input. So to be better stewards of the lake. So you didn't need to pull up the plants and harm the fish. You just needed to work on your better management practices and the nutrients that go into the lake.
Welcome back to Science Matters. We're here at the Region of Waterloo Water Services Mannheim Water Treatment Plant. Joining me today is Tim Walton from the Region of Waterloo Water Services. Tim, tell me about how is water treated in the Region of Waterloo?
Well, we have about 80%, 75 to 80% of our water is groundwater, which is a pretty simple process of disinfection, usually with chlorine, sometimes with a UV irradiation, and sometimes with filtration, depending on the quality of the water. But where we are today is our one surface water treatment plant at the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant, and this is a much more complex process for water treatment. So basically, we take our water from the Grand River. It's pumped from the river into a storage reservoir in Hidden Valley, where we get 2 to 4 days of storage at the Hidden Valley Reservoir. From there, the water's pumped up to the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant, and we go through the processes that we'll describe during this segment.
So all the water that's in the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant comes from the Grand River, or does some of it come from surface water?
All of the source of the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant itself is surface water from the Grand River. That water is then blended as it pumps into the Mannheim Reservoir with groundwater.
Okay, and describe the steps that are involved in the treatment.
Okay, well, the conventional process for water treatment in the province of Ontario is what's called chemically assisted filtration and disinfection. So chemically assisted filtration is really a process where the raw water comes in and is fed by gravity through the water treatment plant itself. And what we do is we add a coagulant. And this coagulant will cause the material in the water or the impurities in the water to clump together and then start to settle out through a process called sedimentation. So we add something called polyaluminum chloride, and this causes the particulate in the water to clump together, some of the dissolved particulate to come out of the water, and then it'll settle through a sedimentation process. Once the water passes through a sedimentation process, then the first stage of disinfection occurs, and this is called ozonation. And ozonation is basically a very strong oxidant. It's the ozone molecule, O3 itself, is diffused into the water, and this will provide a better taste and odor to the water, and it will also destroy harmful bacteria. Predominantly at Mannheim, that process is used for taste and odor control. After ozonation, the ozonated water then will go on to a filtration process called granular activated carbon, and we have an anthracite filter as well, and this process just has the water pass through a filter, which will filter the water, remove any remaining particulate that has not settled out. Then after that, the water will pass into UV irradiation, which is basically a light passing through water at a certain wavelength, and this light will penetrate the cell wall of any microorganism and destroy the ability for that microorganism to reproduce, rendering it inactive at that point. After UV irradiation, then the water will get chlorinated, and after chlorination, it spends some time in a reservoir where chlorine can complete its disinfection process, and at that point, the water is pumped across the street to the Mannheim Reservoir, where it's blended with groundwater and blended with an ammonia, an anhydrous ammonia, and that will form a chloramine, which provides a disinfectant residual throughout the entire distribution system.
So all that process that you described, it sounds pretty complex, but is that all like what's going on behind the scenes when we say like flush the toilet or something like that?
That's right. Every bit of water that comes out of your tap that comes from the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant has gone through those processes. So in Ontario itself, you're required to have certain levels of disinfection, and these levels of disinfection are measured through a logarithmic scale. So you're required to have 2 log inactivation of Cryptosporidium, 3 log inactivation of Giardia, and 4 log inactivation of virus. And all a log means is 4 log, for example, is 99.99% removal. At the Mannheim Water Treatment Plant, since we have ozone, UV, chlorine, and this effective filtration process, you are getting anywhere from 6 to 11 log removal depending on the temperature of the water and other things like that. So we have a very, what's called a multi-barrier approach, a real staged approach, that you have a number of barriers in place to ensure that the water is properly disinfected and kept very clean at all times.
So the water from the Grand River is a little bit discolored. How does it get to becoming clear when we say turn on the tap or the faucet?
Well, really what you're noticing in the Grand River or the raw water itself is two parameters. One is being color. We measure the color of the water coming in, and the other parameter is turbidity. Turbidity is really the measurement that we do that shows the clarity of the water as it moves through the processes. So turbidity is measured by shining a beam of light through a small sample of water, and turbidity is the measurement of that beam of light that gets refracted by particulate that's in the water. So I'm glad you asked that, because turbidity is a key component that we monitor in water treatment. Turbidity itself can range from anywhere from 0.5 NTU, which is the measurement for turbidity, up to 50 or higher in the Grand River. So the purpose of water treatment is to remove that particulate from the water, both undissolved and dissolved, so that the other treatment processes can work. If the water has too high of a turbidity as it moves through the treatment processes, the turbidity or the turbid nature of the small particulate of the water can actually shield the harmful microorganisms that are in the water, and the disinfection processes such as chlorine and UV are not as effective in a turbid water. So when we go through the coagulation, flocculation, and sedimentation process, the purpose of that is to take the water, the discoloration, the turbidity in the water, get it to settle out, and then all of our other disinfection processes are much more effective once that's been removed. So we measure turbidity at all stages as it moves through the water treatment plant, and it's very apparent just from the sedimentation process itself, and after filtration you see a big difference in the level of turbidity, and then our disinfection processes are able to fully function.
Welcome back to Science Matters. Now we know there's water for us to drink. There's also water for us to water our crops with. And let's not forget that water is really important in our ecosystem. But who decides how much to use and when to use it, how to use it? Joining me here today on the show is Professor Rob Delow, who teaches in the Environment and Resource Studies Department here at the University of Waterloo. So Rob...
It's a pleasure, Letha.
So Rob, tell me about what is water governance?
Well, one of the challenges we face in our society is that we have to decide who gets to use our scarce and precious water resources. And there are lots of different ways over human history that we've figured out ways to do that. Everything from emperors to dictators to, in our system, of course, we're in a representative democracy where we elect people to make these kinds of decisions for us. But one of the things that's really interesting about water governance these days is that people in general, you and me and the folks that watch your show, have decided that they want to play a role in making decisions about how we use water and how we protect water resources as well. So water governance is really about all of the different ways in which we can organize ourselves to decide who gets to use water, when they get to use water, and how we deal with the kinds of problems that we create.
Right, and so how is water governed here in Waterloo, and what do you think are some of the governance challenges that we face as community residents here in the region?
Well, I mean, Waterloo, like all municipalities in Ontario, is a municipality, right? Which means that they have some responsibilities under provincial laws for things like land use planning, for example. But a lot of the things that municipalities do are actually decisions about water. Of course, they provide the water that we get when we turn on our taps, but whenever a municipality, for example, decides to allow a new subdivision to be built somewhere, it's also making a decision about water. And so from a governance point of view, it's really shared in our region because of the way we've organized ourselves in Ontario. So, for example, it's the province that makes decisions about who gets access to water through a system called the Permit to Take Water program. The province makes the rules for how land use planning takes place, but it's the municipalities that, of course, are at the front end of making a lot of those decisions and putting them in place. Now, one of the really interesting changes we've seen in Ontario since Walkerton, you'll remember that 6 people became very ill in 2000 with the contamination in Walkerton. In response to that, one of the things the provincial government did is it put in place a system for protecting the sources of water we drink. And that brings us right back to the local level, because we've organized ourselves in Ontario to protect our source waters, as they're called. Those are the rivers and streams and groundwater aquifers that supply the water that comes into our municipal systems. We've organized ourselves at the local level. And so this is where it all comes together from a governance point of view, because we have these bodies called source protection committees that are hard at work across Ontario right now, trying to understand the threats to our water resources and what the kinds of things are that we need to do to protect them. And municipalities are really important players in source protection. They're part of the planning process of trying to figure out where the threats are and what we need to do to protect our water. But what's ultimately going to happen is these source protection committees are going to make a plan for how we should proceed, and it's municipalities that are going to play very important roles in taking the steps that are going to lead to the protection of our source waters, along with all the other people that affect water, which includes landowners and, frankly, all of us. The thing about water, though, is we're all really closely connected to water. I mean, we all drink water, of course, and we all brush our teeth and we all use water, but we're all affected by water. The choices that we make in our homes, in our businesses, on our farms, all have the ability to help out with the kinds of water problems we're facing. But at the same time, there's also really bottomless demand for people to get involved, whether it's in groups in their community, for example, that want to do things like clean up local streams, or whether it's supporting things like programs that a lot of municipalities are putting in place to share water resources during times of scarcity, or even to getting involved with things like source protection committees. The source protection committees that have formed across the province, there are 19 of them, and they all have members who are citizens, ordinary men and women from across the province, who've decided that they're going to give a great big chunk of their time to trying to make the drinking water in their community safer. So there's so much we can do.
And there you have it, my friends, the answer to the age-old question in this community: what's in the water in Waterloo? And as always, you can check out our website for more information on today's episode, or send me a personal tweet at Alethea Zoe. That's it for today's episode of Science Matters. I'm Alethea Chang. Thanks for joining me.